Good morning, everybody. I have a vast topic to discuss with you today, so I'm going to have to speak quickly and cover a lot of material. But I ask you to bear with me, and hopefully, if you don't run me out of town, you'll have me back again with one of the scientists on our advisory council, and we could give you a proper seminar. What I'm going to do this morning is to explain to you two different frameworks that have been developed for natural scientists and medical researchers to explore the natural world. One is the traditional Catholic framework, which was developed within the Catholic Church, and it is the framework of creation. The other framework is the one that was developed in the 18th and 19th centuries especially by Charles Darwin and his disciples, and that is the evolutionary framework. And what I'm then going to show you is that working within the evolutionary framework has been a total disaster for the natural sciences and for medical research. And at the end, I hope that I will at least inspire you to want to make your own investigation of this matter so that you can discern the truth for yourselves. Is there a gadget that I can use to advance the slides? My apologies. If not, if someone can advance them when I tell them to, that would be great. So what we're going to look at is these two different models for doing, frameworks for doing scientific and medical research. The first model is the creation model, which is based on God's revelation as it has been understood in the Catholic Church from the beginning. And this is a framework that presupposes form and function throughout the created world. We also have an evolutionary framework which does not presuppose form and function. As we'll see, it actually presupposes flux, formlessness, and dysfunction. Next slide. The teaching of the Church on creation is very well introduced by St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1. And in chapter 1, verse 20, St. Paul says, "The invisible things of God are clearly revealed in the things that He has made. And therefore, people have no excuse for not believing in God, for not recognizing that there is a Creator." Next. This is the teaching of all the fathers of the Church. For example, St. Basil the Great speaks of God as the master craftsman. And as all the fathers did, he speaks of the incredible design that we can find in all living things, in everything that God made, which gives us some inkling of the beauty, the goodness, the majesty, the wisdom of our Creator. Next. Pope Benedict XVI has continued the tradition of the Fathers of the Church when he speaks of the intelligent design which is the universe. Next. Now we also need to understand that the evolutionary framework is not something new. It's not a great new idea that Charles Darwin thought of in the 19th century. Evolution and evolutionary philosophy has been around for at least 2,500 years. There were pre-Socratic Greek philosophers who were evolutionists, and the fathers of the Church were very familiar with evolution, and they rejected it as being utterly irrational and completely contradictory to the gospel as understood in the Church. And here we see St. Basil telling us that some had recourse to material principles and attributed the origin of the universe to the elements of the world. Others imagined that atoms and indivisible bodies, by their union, formed the nature of the visible world. Deceived by their inherent atheism, it appeared to them that nothing governed or ruled the universe and that all was given up to chance. It sounds as if St. Basil had just read Richard Dawkins' latest book. Next. Now this, on the other hand, is the teaching of all the fathers of the church. And you know the church tells us that in two ecumenical councils, when all the fathers of the church agree on the interpretation of Scripture, on any doctrine of faith or morals, that is authoritative. And this is the teaching of all the fathers, that God, solely by His good will, suddenly brought everything from non-being into being, and everything stood before Him in perfection. That is the teaching of all the fathers. Next. Now, St. Thomas, in the Summa Theologica, takes the tradition handed down to him from the fathers of the church, and he summarizes it very beautifully. And in the Summa, he gives the same teaching, and he talks about the perfection of the universe when it came forth from God's hands. And you'll notice he refers to that as the completeness of the universe at its first founding. That God created all the different kinds of creatures perfect according to their natures, and they all existed together with man because they were all created for us in Adam and Eve. And they all existed together at the same time in perfect harmony. Next. Now in the Summa, St. Thomas makes a very, very important point that was taught by all the fathers and doctors of the church. And that is, this work of creation was the work of God alone. It was the work of the will of God. God did not use any kind of natural process such as we see in the world around us. So St. Thomas teaches that in the works of nature, creation does not enter, but is presupposed to the works of nature. This is one of the most important points in this presentation, because what this tells us is we cannot examine this natural order of things. We cannot study the material processes that are going on all around us and extrapolate from them all the way back to the beginning of creation to explain how everything came to be. Because you see, the revelation of God, as understood by all the fathers and doctors of the church, is that this present order of things only began after the work of creation was finished with the creation of Adam and Eve. So you cannot extrapolate from this order of things all the way back to the very beginning. Next slide. Now there's a corollary to this which is also very important. And in the City of God, St. Augustine articulates it very beautifully. He says, in this creation, had no one sinned, the world would be filled with nature's beautiful and good without exception. So if there are harmful mutations, if there are deformities in this world, it is because of sin. When this universe came forth from God's hands, there were no harmful mutations. There were no deformities. Every kind of creature was created perfect according to its place in the order of nature. Next slide. And this is why St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans chapter 8, says that the entire universe is subject to a mysterious bondage to decay since the original sin. And that the whole universe, out to the most distant galaxies, was not only affected by the original sin, but is in some mysterious way groaning in expectation for the revelation of the sons of God. So the entire universe was affected by sin in a negative way. That is the teaching of all the fathers and doctors of the church. Next slide. Now, the fathers and doctors also gave to the world a philosophical methodology that allowed them to give a complete account of anything in the natural world. And it was a methodology that they received particularly from Aristotle, which presupposed that there is an objective reality out there, and it's an orderly reality. And we can look at anything in nature and we can understand it in terms of what Aristotle calls four causes: material, efficient, formal, and final. Next. We can give a simple example of this, and you may already have studied this in your class, I don't know. But if we look at the Pietà, we can see that it is made of marble. So the material cause is the material of which a thing is made. That's the material cause of the Pietà. The efficient cause is what brings the thing into existence, and in this case, what shapes that statue is the artist Michelangelo using a chisel and other tools. So that's the efficient cause of the Pietà. The formal cause is the form of the thing. And the Pietà has a specific form, so that whether it's made out of wood, marble, plastic, it doesn't matter. That form always tells you this is a Pietà. And then there's a final cause, and that is the purpose for which the thing is designed or made. And the purpose of the Pietà, of course, is to give glory to God by inspiring devotion in people who contemplate the statue. Next slide. The Church so embraced this Aristotelian philosophical approach to studying the world that in an ecumenical council, the Church actually defined that the soul is the form of the human body. This means that the human body is not a collection of material elements and chemicals. The human body has a soul, and it is that soul that unifies all these material elements and makes them a human body. This is extremely important, because what this means is a human being is not a collection of organs and parts that could be cobbled together over millions of years. By this definition, a human body is a unity. It has to have all its organs and bodily systems at one time, and it's the soul that unifies the workings of all of those different material components and makes them work in harmony. This is why, for example, the doctors who made this definition would not understand how you could have something called brain death. Brain death is based on the idea that a human being evolved over a long period of time, and that the thing that differentiates us from chimpanzees is our brain. Therefore, if our brain is no longer functioning in a certain way, we are dead. Our heart could be beating, we could be breathing, we could have normal temperature, but we will have our organs ripped out of our bodies while we're still alive because we are brain dead. But there is no such thing as brain death, because a human being is not a brain. A human being is a soul that resides and gives the form to a body, which means all of its parts, not just certain parts which make us human and other parts which we derived from some other life form. Next slide. So you can see that the Catholic Church gave to the world a beautiful framework that is very conducive to scientific and medical research. And that framework tells us that God created a lawful universe of well-designed creatures that were marred but not ruined by the effects of original sin. Next. Whose function, but not their origins, can be discovered through rational investigation using this Aristotelian framework. Next slide. Now, if you want to see an example of how fruitful this framework is, this is a beautiful example. Sir William Harvey was the first scientist ever to accurately describe the working of the circulatory system in the human body. And when he was asked how he made this discovery, he said that it was because he presupposed that the human body was designed, that all of its parts were part of God's design. And therefore, he asked himself, why would the heart be structured the way that it is? Why would these veins and arteries be structured the way that they are? What would be the purpose? In other words, he looked at the form and he looked for the final causality. And that was how he arrived for the first time in recorded history at the correct understanding of the workings of the circulatory system. Next slide. And next. So you see, this creation model is very fruitful, and it's based on a presumption of form and function and a presumption of final causality or purpose. But what happens in the 18th and 19th centuries, there's a revolution, an intellectual revolution, and the people who spearhead this revolution reject the Aristotelian approach to understanding the natural world. They reject the teaching of all the fathers and doctors of the church that there was a time when God spoke the world into existence, not using any natural process. And they say, no, we can study the world as it is today, and we can extrapolate all the way back to the very first moment. And this framework is popularized especially by Charles Darwin and by Thomas Huxley and others who popularize his ideas. And next slide. We're going to look at now the effects of abandoning the traditional Catholic framework for studying the natural world for this evolutionary framework. And we're going to look at some examples from the past 150 plus years since the publication of Origin of Species. We're going to look at so-called vestigial organs. We're going to look at so-called embryonic recapitulation. And we're going to look at so-called junk DNA. Next slide. Now, as you know, all evolutionists, whether they think that God somehow worked through an evolutionary process or they believe that it happened on its own without any kind of intelligent direction, believe that all living things have developed through natural processes over very, very long periods of time from some one or few common ancestors. Next. And Darwin believed that one of the best proofs for the truth of this hypothesis was that man possessed many different organs and parts of the body which were useless. They did not have any apparent function and could be explained as evolutionary holdovers from an earlier stage of evolution. Next. Now, one of the vestigial organs that Darwin cited was the appendix, and he held that the appendix was left over from an earlier stage of evolution when we lived in trees and we fed on vegetable matter. Next slide. Now, you may remember the famous Scopes trial when Clarence Darrow, the most famous attorney of his time, went down to Dayton, Tennessee to defend a teacher who had supposedly taught evolution against the state law. And William Jennings Bryan, one of the most famous politicians of the time, came down to defend the state law. The mass media of the time portrayed Darrow as the great luminary who was bringing enlightenment to the ignorant Bible thumpers represented by William Jennings Bryan. And many PhD scientists deposed evidence supporting the evolutionary hypothesis. And one of the depositions from a Professor Horatio Hackett from the University of Chicago held forth that in the human body, according to the German anatomist Wiedersheim, there are 180 vestigial organs and systems, parts of the human body. Next slide. Now, one of these, of course, was the appendix. And because of this belief in the evolutionary hypothesis, for 100 years after the publication of Origin of Species, we find that textbooks said things like this, that the appendix is useless and that it has no function whatsoever. This is 100 years after the publication of Origin of Species. Next slide. Now, in spite of this evolutionary bias, it should have been possible for some scientists and medical researchers to question this evolutionary belief. And if you look at where the appendix is situated between your large and small intestine, you might have a clue, if you're using the approach that William Harvey used, that it's there for a reason. Next slide. And indeed, in spite of this faith in evolution, in spite of it, not because of it, scientists and medical researchers by the 1970s had to face the fact that the appendix had functionality. In fact, it's a very important part of our immune system. Next slide. In fact, the only reason why children, once they reach the age of 10, and adults can have their appendix removed and continue to live is because the appendix does its most important work in the very earliest stage of life. When the baby leaves the protected environment of the womb, it goes out into a world which is full of things that are potentially harmful to that little body, and the appendix produces antibodies that protect that little child. This work is done especially in the first weeks and months after the child is born. Next slide. So today, any anatomist worth his salt or her salt knows and teaches that the appendix is part of our immune system. It's totally functional. But this is the BBC Science and Homepage. BBC is supposed to be the best, the most intellectual source of in-depth news reporting. And this is what they have had on their Science and Homepage, a Science and Nature homepage. The appendix has no known function in humans. Evidence suggests that our evolutionary ancestors used their appendixes to digest tough food like tree bark. But we don't use ours in digestion now. Some scientists believe that the appendix will disappear from the human body. Well, I've just proven to you this is utter nonsense. And yet, 35 years after medical journals were already demonstrating that the appendix was functional, we have this nonsense emanating from what is supposed to be the premier news source in the English-speaking world. Something is terribly wrong. Next slide. So let's consider another aspect of this. Because scientists abandoned the traditional Catholic creation framework for the Darwinian evolutionary framework, when they saw people coming into hospitals and doctors' offices with infected appendixes, they concluded, well, of course, the appendix is a holdover from an earlier stage of evolution. It's not functional anymore. Wrong. If they had taken the approach that William Harvey did, what question would they have asked? They would have asked, why is a perfectly good organ, which was created by God as part of the human body, giving us all these problems? And if they'd asked that question, they would have discovered that in societies where people have a healthy lifestyle, where they do not eat processed food, they have almost no disease of the appendix. But evolutionary faith blinded scientists and medical researchers for more than 100 years and prevented them from looking for the true cause of diseases of the appendix, which is not in the appendix. It's in the lousy diet and lifestyle that we live in industrialized societies. Next. And this is why a recent study in the British Journal of Surgery concluded that societies that do not eat processed food, societies that don't eat junk food and have a healthy lifestyle have very little or no disease of the appendix. Next slide. So we see Darwinian presumption of dysfunction leads to very bad science, which actually costs human lives and causes human suffering. Next slide. Here's our second example, the tonsils. Now, tonsils were another part of the body which the evolutionary elite we're certain, were dysfunctional. They had no function. They were a holdover from an earlier stage of evolution. And consequently, next slide, by the 1930s, in the United States alone, 1 to 2 million tonsillectomies were performed every year. When I was a little boy, if you got a couple of infections and your tonsils got inflamed, it was a sure thing, 90% of the time, that your pediatrician would recommend that you have your tonsils removed. That's what happened to me. That meant putting millions of young children under general anesthesia to have their tonsils removed. Well, this made sense if evolution is true and the tonsils are vestigial. The only problem is, next slide, that, of course, once again, evolution eventually collided with reality. And this began to happen especially in the 50s, when polio was a very serious problem. And doctors began to notice something very interesting. People who had had their tonsils removed were more susceptible to polio and to the kind of polio that produces paralysis. Next slide. Doctors all over the world, like this one in Australia, began to record their observations in medical journals. Next slide. And eventually, again by the 1970s, mainstream medical journals were recognizing that people who have their tonsils removed were 3 to 5 times more likely to succumb to paralysis from polio. Next slide. And so today, any doctor worth his salt knows that the tonsils are part of our immune system. And in fact, the tonsils produce specific antibodies that protect us, among other things, from polio. So by having millions of children based on evolutionary faith, not science, stripped of the front lines of their immune system, we will never know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of people may have suffered serious repercussions because of that misguided anti-science. Next slide. And so this is mainstream medicine today. This is what any medical practitioner worth his or her salt knows, that your tonsils are an important part of your immune system and always have been. Next slide. Now, once again, because of this evolutionary faith, which blinded scientists and medical researchers to the truth, when people came in to doctors' offices with blocked air passages and infected tonsils, what did they do? They put the blame on the tonsils. The tonsils are a holdover from an earlier stage of evolution. Let's solve the problem by having them removed. Very misguided. This is an orthodontist, Dr. Silkman, who wrote a fascinating article pointing out that your soft tissues are genetically programmed to grow to a certain size. But your bony structures are not genetically programmed to grow to a certain size. Bodybuilders know that, right? Their bones aren't just going to get bigger because they sit and wish that they would. You have to exercise. So what happens when you have generations of people who live a very unhealthy lifestyle? They don't get enough exercise, they don't do enough physical labor, and they eat junk food. I'll tell you what happens. Their soft tissues will still grow to the genetically predetermined size, but their bony structures will not. What's going to happen? You're going to have people whose tonsils are now too big for the bony structures that house them. You're going to have people susceptible to infection because they're eating rotten, processed junk food, and they're not in good physical condition. And so what does the medical community do for generations? It deals with the problem by removing the tonsils. That is the consequence of embracing this evolutionary faith and abandoning the traditional creation framework. Next slide. Now, this may be the last example that I'll be able to give, and I might have to fast forward to the conclusion. But this is an extremely important example for you to understand. These drawings were made by a famous German German anatomist named Ernst Haeckel. I should say an infamous German anatomist named Ernst Haeckel, who was a disciple of Darwin. And Haeckel argued that a very good proof of the truth of the evolutionary hypothesis was that the human embryo resembles the embryos of chickens, pigs, fish, salamanders at different stages of its embryonic development. And so he popularized this idea of embryonic recapitulation, that the human embryo recapitulates or goes through all the stages of our evolutionary history in the womb of our mother. Now, in his own lifetime, he was exposed as a fraud in that he exaggerated the similarities between the human embryo and the other creatures. But that did not stop this from going into textbooks all over the world, where it still is. Next slide. Now, Father Zahm was a scientist and a priest at Notre Dame who wanted Notre Dame to be up there with Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. And he saw the way we're going to do this is we're going to embrace science. We're going to show we're not stuck back in the Middle Ages. We're going to embrace science. And he, of course, embraced evolution. And Father Zahm wrote books in the early 20th century arguing that the human embryo recapitulates our evolutionary history, that this is evidence that evolution is true. Now, there is a direct line from the time when Father Zahm persuaded Notre Dame that this is the way to go, and the day when Barack Obama walked on stage and received an honorary degree while the real Catholics were being dragged off to the county jail. Because it would be impossible for a Barack Obama to provide any kind of pseudo-scientific justification for abortion if it weren't for the evolutionary pseudoscience that has been used for decades to justify the destruction of innocent human beings. Next slide. Now, Julian Huxley was probably the foremost intellectual of his day. Not really, but in terms of popular perception. He was somebody that people looked up to as a great intellectual. He was much more highly respected in his day than Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens today. And he said that embryology gives the most striking proof for evolution. Think about this. The foremost defender of evolution in his day said, do you want to know what's the best proof of evolution? Embryology. That the human embryo obviously passes through these different stages, a fish stage, an amphibian stage, a reptile stage, a mammalian stage, and then it gets to that human stage. Now, next slide. Keeping in mind that the foremost intellectual champion of evolution, who helped to persuade the intellectual elite of the whole world that if you don't accept evolution, you're a nincompoop, said that that top row of drawings from Ernst Haeckel is the best proof that we have that evolution is true. Well, once again, eventually evolution collided with reality because reality is depicted on the bottom row. Those are actual photographs of the human embryo at the same stage of development as the other embryos. And notice two things. First of all, notice how radically different the human embryo is from all the other embryos, but notice also how different the other embryos are from each other. This is what God revealed. This is what has always been taught in the Catholic Church, that God created the different kinds of creatures by his fiat, not through any kind of evolutionary process. And so it makes sense that 21st century natural science confirms what God revealed and the Church taught from the beginning. Next slide. Gavin de Beer was one of the foremost embryologists of the 20th century. He said that this idea of embryonic recapitulation retarded science, because researchers said, we don't need to study the human embryo. We already know why it develops the way it does. It's recapitulating its evolutionary history. Just like we didn't need to study the tonsils. We didn't need to study the appendix, because we already knew they were useless holdovers from an earlier stage of evolution. Next slide. And this bogus pseudoscience is still in 21st century biology textbooks. Notice how they exaggerate the similarities between the human embryo and the other embryos. And look at this caption, which tells students that all vertebrates, of which of course we are one, in our embryonic development have gill slits. I was taught this in high school, and I went to what was supposed to be one of the greatest schools in the United States. It's rubbish. It is absolute rubbish. What are called gill slits develop into the pharyngeal arches and other parts of your facial anatomy. They have nothing to do with respiration. But I went to a Catholic high school in Vancouver less than a year ago and gave a similar presentation, and I had students come up to me afterwards and say, Mr. Owen, these are our notes from our biology class, vestigial organs, embryonic recapitulation in the 21st century. Next slide. And the real tragedy is that so many Catholic theologians jumped on this bandwagon, embraced this evolutionary pseudoscience without critically examining it in the light of the Catholic tradition. Father Rahner, one of the most famous and influential theologians of the 20th century. And look, Father Rahner wrote that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That means that the human embryo in its development recapitulates its evolutionary history. What does this mean? It means that if Father Rahner is correct, at the moment of conception, you do not have a human being. You have to pass through the fish stage, the amphibian stage, the reptile stage, and the mammalian stage before you finally get to the human stage. So the people who wanted to legalize abortion in the early stages, or who wanted to legalize abortifacient contraception, they could say, look, even your best theologians are smart enough to understand that evolution is true. If we have an abortion at 8 weeks, we're not killing a human being. It's only maybe at the amphibian stage. Do you see what harm this has done? This is a Trojan horse that looked like it was some kind of scientific advance, and it was brought into the bosom of the Catholic community to wreak destruction and bring diabolical disorientation into the minds of the very leaders of the Catholic community. Next slide. I don't have time to talk about junk DNA. I'll just say very briefly that I lost my power here. I'll just say very briefly that junk DNA was a hypothesis that was developed by biologists, and it was based on this observation. You've all learned about DNA, and you've probably learned that only 2% of your DNA actually codes for protein, which makes the different building blocks of your body. So biologists were asking themselves, especially back in the 70s, why is it that only 2% of our DNA actually codes for protein, which seems to be what's really important? After all, that's what makes the building blocks of our bodies. And you know what the answer became mainstream? It's junk. The other 98% is junk. And that's where this scientist, Dr. Ono, coined the phrase junk DNA. Next slide. And Richard Dawkins and the apologists for evolution, they jumped on this and they said, yes, we have all this junk DNA because over the millions of years of evolution, we have accumulated all this genetic material which no longer has any functionality, so it's just there as junk. Next slide. And so when some scientists wanted to study the whole human genome, including the 98% junk DNA, there was a lot of resistance. Why should we pour all this money and resources into studying junk? What a waste of time and effort. Next slide. And next slide. But in spite of this resistance, the Human Genome Project was launched, and lo and behold, we have discovered, big surprise, there is no such thing as junk DNA. Every single day, there are new papers published in medical journals, in scientific journals, showing that what was thought to be junk DNA is actually functional after all. And the functionality is so refined, and the design of the human body is so far beyond our comprehension that we're only beginning to have an inkling of how so many parts of it are used. Next slide. So Dr. John Maddock, who was one of the mavericks who fought to study the so-called junk DNA, has written that this failure to recognize the potential functionality of junk DNA is one of the greatest scientific errors in the history of mankind, because it retarded scientific progress. If we could move ahead a number of slides, I'm going to do my conclusion now. And like I said, I'd love to come back with one of our scientists and do a full presentation, but it's just not possible in the allotted time. Okay, let's stop there. So what we've seen is that in the past 2,000 years, we've had two different frameworks within which to study nature. One was the traditional Catholic framework, which built on the work of Plato and Aristotle and other Greek philosophers, which presumes function and design, which presumes that man is fearfully and wonderfully made, that the basic design of man's body is magnificent, and that therefore our job is to remove obstacles to the healthy functioning of his body, most especially sin, but always with respect for God's design. In this framework, we learn from God's design to improve medicine and medical technology and make new scientific and technological discoveries, and we trust in an all-wise, all-loving, all-powerful God for healing and salvation. Next slide. But in the evolutionary framework, it's completely opposite. We presume dysfunction and absence of design. We believe that God has allowed man to evolve randomly, and therefore man has to correct evolution's mistakes. When faced with an organ or physical system of unknown function, do not presume that it has a function. Instead, develop an evolutionary explanation for its origin. Presume that God did not specially create man as the crown of a perfectly harmonious creation. Rather, presume that he used a process. This is if you believe in God at all. If you're a theistic evolutionist, presume that God used a process of trial and error over hundreds of millions of years to evolve man's body in a world that he had filled with death, deformity, and disease. Please skip ahead 2 more slides and to the last one. Well, as for me and my house, we have decided which one of these 2 models we are going to embrace. We are going to serve the Lord of creation, and not the diabolical demon of evolution. For thou hast formed me and hast laid thy hand upon me. Thou hast protected me from my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for thou art fearfully magnified. Wonderful are thy works. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you.